Gianna Hallowell was the only daughter of one of the most influential families in Gravenholt, raised from childhood to marry well. A good name, a good match, a future chosen by hands other than her own. She was expected to be grateful for that kind of marriage. For a long time, she planned to be exactly that. But somewhere beneath the gratitude she practiced so carefully, she knew the truth. It wasn't what her heart wanted. She sensed, on that one night, that her fate was already being written. What she didn't yet know was how unexpected that fate would turn out to be, that a small, unlooked-for joy was about to warm her heart and hand her something dangerously close to hope, or how briefly that hope would be allowed to last. This is a story about a young woman who was told, twice, what was best for her, and about the night she finally stopped listening. Sometimes, a choice costs us everything, before it gives us everything back. This is the story of how Gianna learned that. And perhaps, in the telling, so will you. Chapter 1. Gianna Hallowell was 20 years old, and her parents, Edmund and Corinne Hallowell, had raised her with one purpose in mind: to become a perfect lady and to secure the best marriage a good name could buy. For more than 2 months, Edmund had been quietly negotiating with the Atwater family of Lendor, the neighboring kingdom, over a match for his daughter, a young man named Silas Atwater, heir to a respected house, and, in time, an alpha in his own right. The ball at Gravenholt Castle, hosted by the Alpha King himself, offered the first real chance for both families to meet in person. Edmund and Corinne saw the opportunity the moment the invitation arrived. The Hallowell name carried enough weight in Gravenholt to add the Atwaters to the guest list without a single question asked, and enough weight to ensure their daughter would be seen there too. A few days passed before the invitation was finally set. When the evening of the long-awaited ball arrived, Edmund and Corinne could hardly contain their excitement, already imagining the match that might come of it. Gianna's excitement, by comparison, was considerably more restrained. She arrived at the castle anxious, her hands cold despite the warmth spilling out through the open doors. She told herself something simple as she stepped inside. Tonight would not decide anything on its own. She only needed to get through it. The moment she crossed into the ballroom, her eyes went straight to his, as if the universe had decided, just for tonight, to play a small cruel trick on her nerves. How did she know he was the one? She had never seen his face before that night. She didn't know, but something in her chest answered the question before her mind had the chance to argue with it. Gianna did not yet know that the king was watching her from across the room. She was not the only one with attentive eyes that night. King Celian Tudor stood near the high table, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, and something in him went suddenly, unexpectedly still. He turned to the steward beside him and asked, "That girl, in the pale gown, who is she?" The steward followed his gaze. "Gianna Hallowell, your grace, daughter of Edmund Hallowell. There's a marriage being arranged, I believe. A family from Lendor." Celian's mouth curved, unhurried. Arranged is not the same as finished. He knew the name Hallowell. He had known, in the vague way a king knows the names of families beneath his notice, that they had a daughter. He had simply never understood until that moment that they had been keeping her like something worth hiding. Now he understood exactly why. Across the room, the introductions had already begun. Edmund Hallowell shook William Atwater's hand with the same warmth of a man closing a good deal. Corinne stood beside her husband, composed, watching her daughter and the young man who now stood in front of her with the careful stiffness of two people who had rehearsed nothing. Silas Atwater was tall in the unremarkable way of someone who had never had to prove it. He held a small wrapped box in both hands like he wasn't sure where to put it. He cleared his throat before he found the words. "My mother sends her apologies. She wasn't well enough to travel." He held out the box, his voice dropping lower, almost apologetic on her behalf. "She asked me to give you this instead." Gianna opened it carefully. Inside lay a necklace, a single white stone, cut into the shape of a teardrop, catching the candlelight. "It's beautiful," she managed. "She'll be glad you think so." He paused. "She has strong opinions about jewelry." It wasn't much of a joke. Gianna laughed anyway, and something in his shoulders came down an inch. William and Edmund excused themselves toward the terrace to talk business, the way fathers do. Corinne watched them go, then looked at her daughter, then at Silas, and made a decision that was not entirely hers to make. "I believe I'll leave you both to get acquainted," she said. "The garden is lovely this time of year. It was not, strictly speaking, proper." A mother did not usually leave her daughter unattended with a man she had known for 11 minutes. But Corinne had watched her daughter's face for 20 years, and she recognized, perhaps before Gianna did, that something here deserved room to breathe. The garden was quiet, lit by lanterns strung low between the hedges. Neither of them had felt anything quite like this before, and for a while, neither of them said much of anything. "Have you read Aldrich's letters?" Silas asked eventually. "The book, not the actual man. I doubt he wrote them himself." "Twice," Gianna said. "I didn't expect you to have heard of it. I didn't expect you to have read it twice." They talked for a long time after that. Books they'd both loved. A summer he'd spent studying the stars from his family's roof. An old argument she'd once had with a tutor about whether astronomy was a science or a superstition with better math. He asked questions like a man trying to remember every answer she gave him. "White lilies," she said at some point, when he asked what flower she'd choose if she could choose only one. "They're my favorite. I couldn't tell you why." "They're my mother's favorite too," he said. "She grows them along the east wall. I could never tell you why either." Gianna smiled at that, and it surprised her, how easily it came. "I play piano," Silas offered, a little abruptly, as though he'd been holding on to it. "Badly, according to my mother." "I sing," Gianna said, and then wished almost instantly that she hadn't. I like to. That's different from being good at it." "Sing something anyway." She should have refused. She didn't. She sang the opening lines of an old song about dreams, nothing more than a few bars, her voice low and a little unsteady in the night air. And when she stopped, neither of them spoke for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. Something had happened in that silence that neither of them was ready to name. Neither of them moved. Neither of them needed to. "Gianna." Her father's voice from the garden path, cheerful and a little too loud. "There you are." She turned. Edmund and William were walking toward them, deep in the satisfied rhythm of men who had agreed on something. Silas stepped back first, his hands returning to that same uncertain position they'd held around the box. Gianna smoothed her skirt, though it hadn't moved. "I trust you two found something to talk about," Edmund said, beaming, already reaching for his daughter's arm. "We did," Gianna said. She didn't say what. Her father didn't ask. He was already turning back toward the ballroom, already thinking of the next conversation, the next arrangement, the next good decision made on his daughter's behalf. Gianna looked back once, over her shoulder, at Silas standing among the lanterns. What no one knew, not Gianna, not Silas, not either of their fathers already shaking hands over a deal that had just quietly become unnecessary, was that somewhere across that same ballroom, a king had already decided that this arrangement would not be allowed to stand. Once the business of the evening had been settled, the Hallowells did not linger at the ball. They were home before the hour grew too late, and yet Gianna lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. She had expected, when she agreed to this marriage, that she would feel resigned. She had prepared herself for resigned. She had not prepared herself for whatever this was. This small, stubborn warmth sitting in her chest, refusing to be reasoned with. She thought of the necklace, still cool against her collarbone where she'd forgotten to take it off. She thought of Silas asking her to sing, and how she had hesitated at first, embarrassed by her own offer, until something in the quiet, patient way he waited made her feel safe enough to try anyway. She thought of the way he'd said, "I doubt he wrote them himself," like he trusted her to laugh before he even knew if she would. She had not expected to hope. Hope had not been part of the arrangement. Some choices are made for us long before we understand what we are agreeing to. Gianna did not yet understand what she had just agreed to, She only knew that for the first time in longer than she could name, she fell asleep smiling at nothing special at all. A knock at the door announced a letter's arrival before breakfast had even been laid on the table. It came sealed in wax the color of dried blood, carried by a rider in Gravenholt colors who did not wait for a reply. Edmund broke the seal at the table, still holding his coffee, and Corinne watched his face change before he'd said a single word aloud. "Edmund," she said. "What is it?" He read it twice before he answered. When he looked up, there was something in his expression Gianna had never seen on him before, a kind of hunger dressed up as pride. "It's from the king," he said. "From Solian Tudor himself." He set the letter down and turned it so they could see, though neither of them reached for it. "He wishes to discuss a union," Edmund said, "with our daughter." The words landed strangely in the quiet of the room. Corinne's hand went still around her cup. Gianna felt something in her chest that she would later understand as dread, though in that first moment it had no name at all, only the sense of a door closing somewhere she could not see. Edmund was already on his feet, already pacing, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way he did when he sensed an advantage. "A good family is one thing," he said, more to himself than to either of them. "A king is another thing entirely." He turned to Corinne, and there was no cruelty in his face, only the plain, uncomplicated joy of a man who believed entirely that he was about to do something wonderful for his daughter. "This changes everything. Edmund," Corinne's voice was careful, "the Atwaters will understand." He was already reaching for paper, for ink, already composing the letter that would end one arrangement to begin another. "I'll go to the castle myself, this afternoon. There's no reason to wait." Gianna said nothing. She had learned, for as long as she could remember, that there was very little use in saying anything at all when her father had already decided. She thought of the garden, the lanterns, the way Silas had gone very still when she sang, like he was afraid that moving might end it. It seemed suddenly that all she had left of it was a good memory and a necklace. Her father was already halfway out the door, the letter ending the Atwater arrangement sealed and ready in his hand. Once it was sent, he would go straight to the castle. In his mind, there was no time left to waste. The castle at Gravenholt felt colder than it had the night of the ball, though Edmund suspected it was less the stone around him than the situation itself, a thought he would never have admitted to anyone. He was shown into a receiving hall with high windows and higher ceilings, and he waited there for longer than felt comfortable before Solian Tudor entered, composed, already dressed as though the meeting had been his idea from the start. Edmund Hallowell. The king said his name like he was testing the weight of it. "Sit." Edmund sat. They spoke for the better part of an hour, about lineage, about land, about the kind of arrangement that made sense between a kingdom and a family that wished to rise with it. Solian asked few questions about Gianna herself. He asked several about her bloodline, her mother's family, whether there was any weakness in it he ought to know about. Edmund answered every question with the eagerness of a man who had waited his whole life for someone important to finally ask. "She'll come tomorrow morning," Edmund offered, before the king had even requested it. To present herself formally, it would be an honor. Solian's mouth moved into something that resembled a smile without quite becoming one. "Good. I don't like to wait once I've decided something." Edmund rode home with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had done something remarkable. He rehearsed the announcement the whole way, choosing his words like a gift, wanting it to land well. He found Corinne and Gianna in the sitting room when he returned, and he did not wait to catch his breath before he spoke. "It's settled," he said. "The king wants to move forward. You'll go to him tomorrow, Gianna, to be presented properly." He beamed at her the way he might have beamed at a prize he'd won. "A king. Do you understand what that means for this family?" Gianna understood exactly what it meant. She simply understood it differently than her father did. "And the Atwaters?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I've already sent word," Edmund said. "It's finished. There was no reason to delay something like this." She did not cry. She had promised herself, somewhere on the ride home from the ball, that she would not be the kind of daughter who made her father's happiness difficult. So she nodded, and she said something about being grateful, and she watched her father's face brighten at hearing exactly what he wanted to hear. Corinne watched her daughter say all the right things, and said nothing herself. Not yet. That night, sleep did not come easily. Gianna lay in the dark and thought of Silas asking her to sing without knowing whether she would. She thought of the necklace, still resting in its box on her dresser, a gift from a mother she would now never come to know. She thought of a door closing on something she had only just discovered she wanted, and how quietly that kind of ache could settle into a person. She did not think Solian Tudor was a cruel man. She had never met him, but she had heard, in her father's retelling of the visit, that the king had asked about her bloodline before asking anything about her, and something in that detail sat wrong in her chest, though she could not yet say why. She thought, he doesn't know me. He only knows what I could be worth to him. She turned that thought over for a long time, in the dark, in the quiet of a house that had already decided her future, without asking what she wanted from it. Toward the middle of the night, she rose and lit a single candle. She took the necklace from its box and held it up to the flame, watching the white stone catch the light the way it had at the ball. She thought of Lady Eleanor Atwater, a woman she had never met, sending something so gentle to a girl she'd never seen. She thought of Silas, and how he would receive the news, a letter arriving to end something before it had truly begun. She wished more than anything that she could have written a single word of that letter herself. She did not sleep again until the sky outside her window had already begun to lighten, gray and reluctant, promising a morning she was not ready for. The ride to the castle was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that Corinne eventually decided to break herself. "You haven't said anything since we left the house," she said, watching her daughter's profile against the passing hedgerows. "There isn't much to say." Gianna kept her eyes on the road ahead. "It's decided already." "That doesn't mean you can't say it." Gianna was quiet for a moment longer. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than she meant it to be. "I'm not happy about this, Mother. I know I'm supposed to be. I know what it means for Father, for all of us. But I'm not." Corinne reached over and took her daughter's hand, and for a while she said nothing at all, only held it, the way she had when Gianna was small and afraid of things that turned out not to matter. "I know," Corinne said finally. "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why. But a king, Gianna, whatever else is true, he can give you a life most women never see. Safety, position, a name that opens every door for the rest of your life." She squeezed her daughter's hand once. "I'm not saying your heart doesn't matter. I'm saying it isn't the only thing that has to survive this." Gianna didn't answer. She only looked out at the fields going by, and let her mother believe for now that the words had landed the way they were meant to. The castle received them formally, a steward, a long corridor, a set of doors opening onto a hall far grander than the one Edmund had described. Solian Tudor was already waiting when they entered, standing near the window with the same ease of a man who had never once worried about being kept waiting himself. "Lady Hallowell." He inclined his head toward Corinne, then let his gaze settle on Gianna a moment longer than courtesy required. "And you must be Gianna." "Your Grace," Gianna said, and dropped into the bow she'd practiced that morning in front of her mirror. "There's no need for that." Solian's tone made it sound generous, though it wasn't a question. "Sit, both of you." They spoke for a while about nothing that carried any weight, the ride, the weather, a hunting party he'd hosted the previous season that he described in more detail than either of them had asked for. He spoke often about himself, and rarely paused long enough to be asked anything in return. When Corinne mentioned gently that Gianna was a great reader, Gianna began to say something about a book she'd loved that year, but Solian was already speaking again, moving the conversation somewhere that interested him more, as though her sentence had simply run out of time to matter. He did not raise his voice. He did not say anything unkind, but there was a carelessness in the way he spoke over Gianna's answers before she'd finished giving them, a certainty that his own opinions were simply worth more than whatever she might add. And by the time they rose to leave, Gianna understood something about him that no one had needed to tell her. He did not want to know her. He wanted her to belong to him. And he assumed those were the same thing. The ride home was quieter than the ride there had been. Corinne didn't ask what her daughter thought of the king. Perhaps she already knew. Perhaps she wasn't ready to hear the answer out loud. Only a few days had passed, though to Edmund it had felt far longer. He had been waiting for word from the king almost since the moment he'd left the castle. The letter came before supper, carried by the same writer in the same Gravenholt colors, sealed with the same wax the color of dried blood. Edmund read it standing, this time, too eager to sit first. "He wants to move forward," he said, already reaching for paper of his own to answer the king. Formally. He wants the arrangement settled before the season turns. He looked up, and there was nothing in his face but satisfaction. "I'll write to him tonight. There's no reason to let this sit any longer." Something in Gianna broke quietly, the way a thread gives way after being pulled too many times. She had not meant to cry. She had promised herself, more than once now, that she wouldn't. But the tears came anyway, sudden and humiliating, and Corinne rose at once to comfort her, a hand already reaching for her daughter's shoulder. Gianna stood instead. "It's not fair," she said. The words came out steadier than she felt, and they stopped both her parents mid-motion. "I won't marry him." Her voice rose, and she let it. "Not because you think it's best for me, not because he's a king and a good family isn't good enough anymore." "Gianna," Edmund started. "I sat in that room with him." She was not shouting, not quite, but there was a firmness in her she had never let either of them hear before. "He asked about my mother's bloodline before he asked me a single question about myself. He didn't ask about anything I care about. He talked about his hunting party for 20 minutes and never once asked what I thought about anything." She looked at her father directly. "That is not a man who wants to know me. That's a man who wants to own something he decided he liked the look of." "You don't know what you're talking about." Edmund's voice hardened. "Your mother and I know what's best for you. We have always known what's best for you. The marriage with Silas wasn't something I wanted either. Not at first. Not because of him. Because it was arranged. Because no one asked me." Her voice caught, but she pushed through it. "But I met him. And for the first time in my life, I felt something I've never felt before. And you're asking me to give that up for a man who looked at me like I was a piece of land worth adding to his kingdom. Enough." Edmund's face had gone dark. "You will do as this family needs." Gianna did not answer. She turned, and before Corinne could reach for her again, she was through the door. She did not think. She did not plan. There was a horse tethered a short distance from the house, and she was on it before anyone came after her, riding into the coming dark with no direction in mind at all. Only the need to be anywhere that was not that house. Night had fully settled by the time she stopped, at the edge of a river she did not recognize, beneath a tree whose branches hung low over the water. She slid down from the horse, and her knees gave out beneath her before she'd meant them to. She knelt there in the dark, and finally let herself cry the way she hadn't allowed herself all day, not carefully, not quietly, but completely. The horse stood over her for a long while, patient, unmoving. Then, slowly, it lowered itself to the ground beside her, and Gianna leaned into its warmth without quite deciding to, her tears slowing at last into something closer to exhaustion. She did not remember falling asleep. She only remembered much later that the last thing she'd thought before the dark took her was Silas's face in the garden lantern light, and how far away that night now felt, like something that had happened to someone else. Chapter 2. Gianna woke with the gray light of morning filtering through the branches overhead, her body stiff from the ground, the horse still beside her, patient as it had been all night. Her head was clearer now than it had been the evening before, not lighter, only clearer, the way grief settles into something a person can carry once the first violence of it has passed. She knew she couldn't stay by the river. She knew, too, with a kind of tired certainty, exactly what waited for her at home. She rode back slowly, in no hurry to arrive. Edmund was waiting in the doorway when she did, and whatever relief he might have felt at seeing her safe was buried, immediately, beneath something colder. "Do you have any idea," he said, before she'd even dismounted, "what it would have meant if anyone had seen you out there, alone, at night, like some—" He stopped himself, jaw tight. "You will marry the king, Gianna. That was decided before you ran, and it remains decided now. Father." "I sent the letter last night," he said, "while you were gone. It's finished. The Atwaters have been told formally that there is no longer an arrangement to discuss. But I thought you'd already sent that letter, days ago." Gianna searched his face, confused. "I thought better of it at the time," Edmund said. "It seemed wiser to wait, to speak with the king in person before closing the door on the Atwaters entirely." He held her gaze, unmoved. "And whatever you did last night, I knew you'd come back. I knew you'd do the right thing in the end." The word finished landed the way it always did now, final, immovable, a door closing somewhere she couldn't see. Gianna said nothing. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said, and shouted, and ignored. She went inside, past her mother's worried face, past the breakfast no one had touched, and up to her room, where she sat for a long while before she let herself accept the shape of what her life had just become. She did not cry again. She had done enough of that already. Instead, toward evening, she took out paper and ink, and she wrote. Not to her father, not to Solean, but to Silas. She told him everything. The letter her father had sent, ending things before either of them had a chance to object. The king's interest, and what it had cost her to sit in that room and understand. Too late. Exactly what kind of man wanted her now. She told him what she had said to her parents the night before, the words she'd shouted that she didn't regret, even now. She told him that she had decided, in the end, to do what was best for her family, and that she had to believe somehow that it would come to be best for her too. And she told him, as plainly as she knew how, that she was sorry, that whatever this had been, in the garden, in that single evening, she would carry it even if she was never permitted to keep it. She did not ask him to do anything. She only wanted him to know the truth of it, from her, before the silence closed in for good. She sealed the letter herself and sent it before she could think better of it. The weeks that followed moved with a strange, indifferent speed, the kind of time that refuses to slow down simply because a person isn't ready for it. The wedding began to take shape around her, piece by piece, whether she wanted it to or not. Seamstresses came with bolts of pale silk. A steward from the castle arrived twice with lists of names for the guest register. Her mother sat with her most evenings, going over details Gianna barely registered. Flowers, music, the order of the ceremony, and Gianna answered when she was asked to, and otherwise let the days pass through her like weather. She had not heard from Silas. She hadn't expected to. She had asked him, in her own way, not to answer. Solean, for his part, was barely present in any of it. He sent no letters of his own, asked after none of the details being arranged in his name. What instructions did arrive came through stewards, brief and businesslike. A date confirmed, a seating arrangement approved, a note about which houses of Gravenholt must be seen at the ceremony, and which could be safely overlooked. It was as though the marriage itself required nothing further from him beyond the bloodline he'd already secured. He had wanted her once, across a crowded room. Now that the arrangement was settled, he seemed content to let it finish itself. On the morning the flowers were meant to be decided, 2 arrangements were brought to her in the sitting room, one in each of the florist's hands. The first was roses, deep red, the kind every noble bride in Gravenholt had carried for 100 years. The second was white lilies. The moment the lilies were placed in her hands, something in Gianna's chest gave way all at once. The garden, the lanterns, a young man asking what flower she'd choose if she could choose only one, his mother growing the same lilies along an east wall in a kingdom she would now never see. She did not decide to run. Her body simply did it before her mind caught up, both bouquets falling to the floor behind her as she was already moving, already through the door, already crossing the grounds toward the castle stables where the wedding horses were kept. This time, she knew exactly where she was going. She took a horse from the stalls, dark-coated, saddled, and ready for a groom who hadn't yet arrived to claim it, and she was riding before anyone thought to stop a bride 2 days from her own wedding. She rode for hours, past fields she didn't recognize into ones she did only by the shape of a name she'd heard once, months ago, in a garden. Lendor. She didn't know exactly how she would find him once she arrived. She didn't know what she would say, or what he would think of her for coming at all. But she went anyway, because staying had already cost her everything it was going to cost her, and there was nothing left to protect by turning back. She reached the outskirts of Lendor as the afternoon began to soften toward evening, and stopped at a small market street to ask after the Atwater name. The shopkeepers there seemed to know it well enough. A respected house, they told her, easy enough to find if she followed the road north past the old mill. The house, when she found it, was larger and finer than she had imagined, set back from the road behind a stretch of green lawn. Gianna stood at the end of the path, the reins still in her hand, the horse waiting patiently beside her, and found that she could not make herself walk any closer. She had come all this way with nothing but the need to come. Now that she had arrived, she had no idea what to do with herself. She turned her back to the house, unable to face it, and stood there instead, looking out at the empty road behind her, a woman with nowhere left to run and nowhere yet to arrive. That was how Silas found her. He came up the road on horseback, unhurried, the way a man rides when he isn't expecting anything to change the shape of his day. And then he saw her, and everything about him went still. Gianna? She turned at the sound of her name, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. He dismounted quickly, closing the distance between them with none of the careful formality that had marked every moment they'd shared before. "What are you doing here?" His voice wasn't unkind, only stunned, searching her face for an answer he couldn't yet imagine. "I don't know," she said, and it was the truest thing she'd said in weeks. He looked at her a moment longer, at the dust on her riding clothes, the exhaustion she couldn't quite hide, the way she stood like someone who had run out of plan several hours ago. Whatever he saw in her face decided something for him. "Come with me," he said. "Not here. Somewhere quieter." He didn't ask why she was there, or whether his parents should be told first. He simply led both horses along a path skirting the edge of the property, away from the house, away from any window that might catch them, until the road gave way to rows of vines heavy with late-season grapes, the light beginning to gold at the edges as the afternoon leaned toward evening. There, finally, she told him everything. She told him about the letter her father had sent, and the one he'd sent instead, days later, the delay that had cost her nothing but false hope. She told him about the king, the questions about her bloodline, the way he'd spoken over her, the certainty in him that wanting her was the same as knowing her. She told him about the night at the river, and the morning after, and the weeks of silk and flower arrangements that had felt like watching someone else's life being built around her. "I know this might sound foolish," she said, not quite able to look at him now. "But I felt something for you I don't have a name for, and I needed you to hear it from me, not in a letter. Here, looking at you." Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the careful lightness she remembered from the garden. "When your father's letter came," he said, "ending things, I told myself it made sense. A king is a king." He shook his head slowly. "But then your letter came after it, and that one broke something in me the first one hadn't managed to. I thought I'd lost you to a decision that had nothing to do with either of us. I didn't expect to lose you and still think about you every day since. I never meant to hurt you. I know." He reached for her hand, and this time neither of them hesitated. "You didn't. Not really. The world did that. You just got caught in the middle of it same as I did." She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding for weeks. "I don't know what happens now," she admitted. "I don't know what your parents will say, or what my father will do when he realizes I'm gone." "We'll face that," Silas said. "Together this time, not through letters. He stepped closer, and she didn't step back. The light had gone the deep gold of early evening around them, the vines heavy and green on either side, and when he finally closed the last small distance between them, she met him halfway. The kiss was quiet, gentle, nothing like the chaos of the last several weeks, only the two of them, finally choosing something for themselves, with no father, no king, no arrangement standing between them. When they parted, Silas kept her hand in his. "Come meet my parents properly," he said. "Let's see what we can put right." They rode back toward the house slowly, the horses walking side by side in the last of the evening light. And for the first time in weeks, Gianna felt something like calm settle over her. William Atwater was in the front garden when they arrived, and whatever question had been forming on his face at the sight of a strange horse and an unannounced guest fell away the moment he recognized her. "Miss Hallowell?" He looked between her and his son, clearly searching for the shape of what he was seeing. "I don't understand. Your father sent word weeks ago that—" "I know what he sent," Gianna said. "I came anyway. I needed to say some things myself, before it was too late to say them." Silas stepped in beside her. "Father, there's a great deal to explain. I think it's better if we all sit down together." William studied his son for a moment, then nodded slowly and led them both inside. The house was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire already lit in the sitting room, warm in the way a home feels when it has been lived in gently for a long time. It was there, only a few minutes later, that Lady Eleanor Atwater came down to join them, moving carefully, one hand resting on the banister. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Gianna, and something in her face softened immediately before anyone had said a single word of introduction. "You're the Hallowell girl," she said, "the one who sent Silas that letter." Gianna felt her face go warm. "Yes, my lady. I'm sorry to arrive like this without any warning." "Don't be sorry." Eleanor crossed the room and took both of Gianna's hands in her own, studying her the way a person studies something they have wondered about for a long time. "I've thought of you more than you'd guess, since that letter came. A girl who writes something so honest to a young man she'd only just met. I told William that was not a girl who did anything by half measures." She glanced at the necklace still resting at Gianna's collarbone, and her expression changed into something quieter. "I see you kept it." "I never took it off," Gianna admitted. "Not since the night you sent it." For a moment, neither of them said anything else. It was William who finally broke the silence, gesturing them all toward the chairs by the fire. "I think," he said, "we had better hear the whole of this properly." So Gianna told them, the king's letter, the visit to the castle, the confrontation with her father, the night at the river, and finally the wedding, 2 days from now, that she had left behind her, unfinished, in a room with 2 bouquets on the floor. She did not soften any of it, and she did not ask for their forgiveness in the telling. She only told the truth of it, plainly, the way she had promised herself she would if she ever had the chance. When she finished, William was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap. "Your father ended our arrangement to chase something grander," he said finally. "That's his right, I suppose, as a father. But you rode here alone, 2 days before your own wedding, to tell my son the truth with your own voice." He looked at her steadily. "That tells me a good deal more about your character than any letter your father ever sent me." "I won't pretend this doesn't complicate things," Eleanor added, glancing at her husband. "A king will not take this quietly, whatever comes of it. But I did not raise my son to marry a woman chosen for him by other people's convenience, and I certainly won't stand in the way of one he chose for himself." Silas reached over and took Gianna's hand again, in front of his parents this time without hesitation. "Then you'll help us," he said. "Whatever needs to be done, whatever her father says, whatever the king does." William exchanged a long look with his wife, then nodded slowly. "We'll help you," he said. "Both of you. Let the king have his pride. We'll see what's left of it once he realizes a woman cannot be kept by a title alone." Gianna looked around the room, at Silas beside her, at Eleanor's hand still resting warmly over hers, at William already turning his mind toward what needed to be done next, and felt, for the first time since the night of the ball, that she was no longer standing entirely alone. Gianna and Silas rode back to Gravenholt together, arriving as the sun was setting on the second day since she'd fled her own wedding. Edmund was waiting in the doorway when they arrived, as he always seemed to be, Gianna thought, as though he spent his life standing in doorways, deciding what to do with whoever appeared at them. His face, at the sight of his daughter beside Silas Atwater, instead of alone, went through several expressions before settling on something hard. "You," he said to Silas, "have no business being here." "I have every business being here." Silas dismounted first, then helped Gianna down, and did not let go of her hand once she was standing. "I came because Gianna asked me to, and because I intend to marry her, with or without your blessing." Edmund's face reddened. "She is promised to the king." "She was never asked," Silas said. "There's a difference between promised and given, sir. I think you know that better than most." For a long moment, no one spoke. Corinne appeared behind her husband in the doorway, and the look she gave her daughter was not one of anger at all, only a kind of tired relief, as though some part of her had been waiting for this moment since the night at the river. "There will be no undoing what's already been set in motion," Edmund said finally, though something in his certainty had thinned since the morning she'd run. "Then we'll face whatever comes," Gianna said. "Together. But I won't stand in that chapel 2 days from now and marry a man I don't love, Father. That much is finished, whether you send another letter or not." Word reached the castle by the following morning, not through any letter Edmund sent, but through the kind of talk that moves faster than any writer, carried by servants and stewards, and the small, unavoidable gossip of a kingdom that had been preparing for a royal wedding. By the time Solian Tudor heard that his bride had fled to Lendor and did not intend to return, the story had already taken a shape of its own. He did not rage. He did not send soldiers after her, though some in his court expected him to. Instead, when the matter was raised before him, he waved it away with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything else. "A woman who runs before the vows are spoken is not a woman I'd have wanted after them," he said, to no one in particular, in a hall full of people who would repeat it exactly as he intended. "I have no interest in a bride who cannot be trusted to stay where she's placed. Let the Atwater boy have her. I was never short of better options." It was, everyone understood, not quite the truth. But it was the version of the truth a king could afford to tell, and so it became the only version anyone dared repeat aloud. At the Hallowell house, the weeks that followed were quieter than any that had come before them. Edmund did not forgive easily. Pride does not unmake itself in a single conversation. But day by day, the hardness in him softened into something more resigned, and eventually into something almost like understanding. He watched his daughter write to Silas, watched the color return to her face in a way it hadn't in months, and slowly, without ever quite admitting he'd been wrong, he stopped speaking of the king at all. By the time the leaves had begun to turn, Edmund and Corinne had made their decision. There was little left for them in Gravenholt now, a broken arrangement, a king who wanted nothing further to do with their name, and a daughter whose future had already planted itself in another kingdom's soil. They would move to Lendor, Edmund announced one evening, as though it had been his idea all along. It would be better, he said, to be near their daughter. Better, though he did not say this part aloud, than to remain in a place that would always remember exactly how the arrangement had ended. The wedding took place in early spring, in the garden behind the Atwater house, beneath an arch woven through with white lilies. Gianna wore ivory, simple and unadorned, her hair loose the way it had been the night of the ball in Gravenholt. At her collarbone, resting exactly where it always did now, sat the white stone necklace, cut into the shape of a teardrop, the same one that had been placed in her hands the first night she'd ever heard Silas's voice. She had never taken it off since, not once. Not through the fear, or the running, or the weeks of not knowing what would become of any of it. It had stopped being simply a gift from a woman she barely knew. It had become the one thing she'd carried, unbroken, from the beginning of this story to its end. Lady Eleanor Atwater sat in the front row beside William, her hand resting lightly over his. watching her son with the brightness of a mother who has waited a long time to see her child settled and happy. When Gianna passed her on the way to the altar, Eleanor reached out and touched her arm, just briefly, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. Edmund walked his daughter down the aisle himself. He did not smile the whole way. Old pride does not disappear entirely, even in defeat. But when he placed her hand in Silas's, he held on to it a moment longer than the ceremony required. And Gianna understood, without either of them saying it, that this was as close to an apology as her father was ever going to offer. The ceremony itself was brief, the way I have always believed the best ones are. Few words, and all of them true. It was afterward, in the quiet after the vows and before the celebration properly began, that Silas leaned close to Gianna and said something meant only for her. "I want a life full of noise," he said, low enough that no one else could hear it. "Children who look like you. A house that's never quiet enough for either of our father's taste." He smiled at her, the same smile she remembered from the garden, the one that had undone her before she'd understood what was happening. "I want you to be their mother someday, whenever you're ready." She didn't answer with words at first. She reached up, touched his face, and looked at him for a long moment before she finally spoke. "I will be the happiest woman in the world, building that family with you." Some love stories are remembered because nothing ever goes wrong in them. This was never going to be one of those. It is remembered instead because someone, eventually, decided that what she felt was worth more than what she had been told to want. Gianna Hallowell was told twice what was best for her. In the end, she chose for herself, and found that the two were, at last, the very same thing. Some choices cost us everything, before they give us everything back. Gianna learned that lesson the hard way, through a ballroom she never asked to enter, a king she never chose, and a quiet garden where her heart made a decision long before she had the courage to admit it out loud. Perhaps you felt it too. That fear of disappointing the people who raised you, set against the quiet certainty of what your own heart already knows. If this story found something true in you, that's exactly why I tell them. If you'd like to hear more stories like Gianna's, consider subscribing. It means more of these stories find their way to you. And if this one moved you even a little, a like helps it reach other hearts who might need it just as much. Thank you for staying with me until the end. With love, Evelyn.